All right, well, we're going to get the program started. Welcome to the Arizona Museum of Natural History. Thank you for being here tonight. You are making the last of the lecture series, the Thrive lecture series. So glad you could make it tonight. Before we get started, my name is Allison Stoltman. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Arizona Museum of Natural History. And with me, we have the Curator of Anthropology, Dr. Sanchez Morales. And I also want to acknowledge any AZMNH board members. Sam, I see you. Stand on up. And then any museum and cultural advisory board members. I see Karen right here and at the back. So thank you very much. It's through your support that we can offer these programs. And also along with our sponsors, Alliance Urgent Care, and the National Bank of Arizona. Do we have any representatives from them tonight? They are our sponsors for this museum series. So we're incredibly grateful. This is how we can continue to create thought-provoking, interesting opportunities for our community. And with that, I'm going to pass you over to the curator, Dr. Sanchez Morales.
Thank you, Alison. So good evening, everyone. As Alison said, this is the fourth and last talk of the Thrive lecture series, and I'm really, really happy to see the great turnout that we have today. I think, Alison, that we're going to need a bigger and new auditorium next year because, yeah, we can't possibly fit everyone here. Yeah, there you go. So again, my name is Ismael Sanchez Morales. I'm the curator of anthropology here at the museum. And before we get started, we want to acknowledge that the city of Mesa is located on the traditional lands of the Otham, known as the Pima, and the Pipash, known as the Maricopa, and we offer our respects and honor their legacy and heritage. All right, so the Thrive Lecture Series is part of the programming associated with our newest exhibit, which is called Thrive, the First People, Yesterday, Today, and Forever. And this exhibit explores the environmental and human histories of the Sonoran Desert and its first peoples, not only through archaeological science, but also through the lived-in experiences and the traditional knowledge of representatives of the Otham and Pipash communities of central and southern Arizona. If you haven't seen this exhibit, I invite you to go and explore it after the talk. Remember that the museum is open until 8 p.m. tonight. And Thrive is going to be open until August 17, which is just around the corner. I think the 17th is this Sunday. So, yeah, so please go and explore this exhibit at the end of this talk. Again, we want to thank our sponsors, the Alliance Urgent Care and the National Bank of Arizona for sponsoring the Thrive Lecture Series. Before I introduce our awesome speaker, I also want to thank you all because it's because of you that this series is possible. And I'm really, really happy to see that so many members of our community are interested in the topics such as the one that we're going to be hearing about tonight. And so, tonight we have a very special guest and a very special topic. Cool, colorful birds and archaeology. It doesn't get any better than that. And so tonight we're honored to have Dr. Christopher Schwartz as our invited speaker. Dr. Schwartz is the City of Phoenix archaeologist. He works at Setavaki Museum and holds a BTC faculty appointment at the Arizona State University. Most of his work is focused on the U.S. Southwest and the Mexican Northwest, where his research interests include long-term human-animal interactions and the transformative social impacts of long-distance exchange in the past. He's also the lead editor of Birds of the Sun, a University of Arizona Press volume that explores the significance of non-local Scarlet Macaws to past and present indigenous communities in the U.S. Southwest and the Mexican Northwest. Tonight, he will be talking about Scarlet Macaws and people in the pre-Hispanic U.S. Southwest and the Mexican Northwest. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Schwartz.
All right, can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me okay? Is this a little bit better? Maybe. Okay, perfect. Thank you. There are still some spots in the front over here if people want to come in from the back. You may be like, let's see how things go. If this is interesting, I'll stick around. If not, I think I'll get out of here. I do the same thing at archaeology conferences. It's totally fine. I am thrilled to be here. I'm really, really excited. I'm always super excited to talk about this research because I think it's so fascinating, and hopefully that fascination and interest comes across to all of you today. And let me know, I will say, let me know if this goes out or something like that. If people can't hear anything, I'll raise your hand or let me know otherwise. Okay, so like Dr. Sanchez Morales said, I'm going to be talking today, if I can make sure this thing's turned on. I'm going to be talking today, we'll go here, about Scarlet Macaws and people in the US Southwest and Mexican Northwest. And when I give talks like these, I have never given a talk here before. I'm really excited to be here presenting for the first time. But I like to let people know about my background and some of the work that I've done. And so I made this slide for some other purposes, but just to give you guys an idea of where I come from, what I'm interested in. My actually journey in archaeology started at a site called Teotihuacan in the state of Mexico, in central Mexico. One of the most incredible archaeological sites, I think, in the world, if not the most incredible. And I was, for years, planning to be a Mesoamerican archaeologist working in Mexico and didn't want anything to do with the Southwest. I was like, get me out of this place. It's way too hot here. And over time, I've my research interest has shifted and I've kind of moved northward, right? And with me, so has this interest in looking at Scarlet Macaws and how they interact with people. I have also done some work in archaeological chemistry. For years, I trained at the archaeological chemistry here at Arizona State University, which is a great lab for working on stable radiogenic isotopes. So if you don't know about that, that's kind of a cool and interesting thing, and I'll draw on a little bit of that as I go into the presentation and talk a little bit about what our findings have been. This is a picture from the Amarin Foundation in Dragoon, Arizona, where we held a seminar that became a book called Birds of the Sun that I'm going to draw on really heavily in this presentation. And it's also an incredible place. I always put in a plug for it because it's really fun. This is in the Scholar House in the library where they have these big meetings that allow scholars with different expertise to come together and work together and spend days and days working through topics and preparing manuscripts and books and things like that. So, and then after I finished my graduate degree, this is all stuff I kind of did as a graduate student. When I finished my graduate degree in 2020, after a stint at Northern Arizona University, I came back down to Arizona and started work down to Phoenix, and started working in cultural resource management. So I was a consulting archaeologist for some years down here, 3 years, 4 years, which really led into the work that I'm doing now as the City of Phoenix archaeologist, right? So I have, I think, an interesting blend of academic and more practical cultural resource management background that I hope comes across in some of this work and maybe allows me to speak better to public audiences in some way. I don't know. I hope so. So today, that's enough about me. The most important thing that we're going to talk about today are Scarlet Macaws. And this is a Scarlet Macaw. If you've never seen a Scarlet Macaw, if you're like, what the heck is a Scarlet Macaw? This is the colorful bird that was being referred to. And the reason that we are all here gathered today to chat. So, who has seen a Scarlet Macaw in real life or interacted with them? Okay, a good number of people. What were your experiences like with a Scarlet Macaw? Fun? Could it speak to you? Yeah?
They don't make good pets.
They're terrible pets. Yeah, they are truly non-compliant and I would say horrifying and mean, but very intelligent. Yeah. What else? What else were some experiences that people had?
They tried to bite my ear.
Yeah, that's very common. Very, very common. Yep.
When I was in record, always stole my glasses.
Yeah. Yeah.
He looks so cute to be that vicious.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. They are truly beautiful, beautiful birds, but they have a whole host of characteristics that make them, that I think elevate them and separate them, I think, from a lot of the animals that people are familiar with and interact with on a daily basis, right? And in some interesting ways, like what I found in talking to people is that, you have classes of animals that are kind of out in the wild animals. You have classes of animals that are domesticated animals that people have interactions with, like your dogs and cats and things like that. And in a lot of ways, Scarlet Macaws are right up there with the most personality-driven and interesting and compelling domestic animals. And yet, they're really not, a domesticated animal in any sense of the word. They are truly very, very non-compliant, very intelligent, but also very challenging to live with and to care for and to have. And I've worked with a lot of macaw breeders, and that's part of how I come to the work that we're presenting today and talking about today is from being around these birds. And interacting with them. So that's a truly kind of a really fun component of the work that I've done. But they really, every time I give a presentation like this, they kind of elicit this kind of response, right? That people feel very passionately about them if they've been around them. So this, like I was saying, this is a scarlet macaw. And this is actually, for folks who don't know this, there are two subspecies of scarlet macaws, Macao cyanoptera. And you can tell that it is this one because it does not have a green band in between the yellow and the blue. And I'll show you an image later of one that does have a green band, and that is an Macao. They have different geographical distributions, one being further south in Central America, southern parts of Central America and into South America, the other being further north in Mexico and Central America. So there's your fun fact about macaws, and that is the most detail I'll get into about that thing for the day. Now, you may also be interested to know that scarlet macaws have been found at archaeological sites here in the U.S. Southwest and Mexican Northwest. And I mean hundreds of scarlet macaws have been found at sites in this region. One thing I like to start off by saying is that, just to give some background, is that they're not the only bird that's been found, not the only parrot that's been found at some of these sites. Archaeologists have also located military macaws, who also have some of the really impressive coloration that you can see on the feathers right up here in the right corner there. And they've also found thick-billed parrots, as well as white-fronted parrots. But of these, scarlet macaws have been by far the most common, and as you can see from their distribution, which I'll talk about in just a second, they're also the most distant and most difficult probably to procure in this area. And I say N is more than 250 here, meaning that there are more than 250 scarlet macaws that have been found at archaeological sites. If you include the site of Paquimé, which I do and talk about in this presentation, that number jumps all the way up to like 750. So you're really looking at a lot, and if you compare that to military macaws, white-fronted parrots, and thick-billed parrots, there are probably fewer than 50 of those birds that have been found in the Southwest. And then if you include Paquimé in that, fewer than 70 or 80. So it really doesn't even compare, right? There really seems to be a preference for scarlet macaws in this area. Another interesting thing to point out, 70 to 80% of scarlet macaws that have been found in archaeological contexts appear to have died around 1 year old. If you've been around macaws, you know that they actually can live to be something like 70 or 80 years old in captivity. They don't live quite as long in the wild, but 70 to 80 years versus a single year is a pretty serious discrepancy, right? So there's definitely something interesting going on there. People have suggested that there was some kind of sacrifice that may have happened, that these birds were sacrificed at a certain time. Some of the research we've been doing is indicating it's more likely perhaps that they just weren't doing so hot being fed diets predominantly of corn. And being kept in, indoors, not being allowed to go outside, being kept in environments that their bodies are really not equipped to handle. And humidity being one of the main components of that, right? That they're really used to the tropics. And as you very well know, the Sonoran Desert is in no way the tropics. So the other thing I want to say before I get started is that live birds as well as feathers appear to have been acquired by people in the Southwest and Northwest. So we know we have evidence of the physical birds. We also have evidence of clothing and garments and other kinds of things that indicate that the feathers were probably moving around as well. And we found instances where feathers have been deposited. And actually, if you look, as we get into talking a little bit about Mesoamerica, you'll see that the feathers were probably traded. I would argue far more feathers were traded and moved around on the landscape to these sites than there were macaws themselves. And they might have been really important in the clothes that people were wearing and things like that. So, and just to give you guys a little indication of what the distributions of these birds are, on the right side you can see the natural distribution of scarlet macaws in red. In green you have military macaws, and in yellow you have thick-billed parrots, right? So thick-billed parrots and military macaws range all the way up into Chihuahua and Sonora. Would have been much easier to procure than scarlet macaws all the way down here in kind of the Huasteca region of the eastern Gulf Coast of Mexico. And yet there seems to be a really clear preference for scarlet macaws in the Southwest. Now, the other thing I want to do before I jump into the major points of the topic I'm talking about is to give respect to the people who, you may be saying to yourselves, Chris, how do you know that these birds died at 1 year of age? And the reason we know that is because of these pioneering archaeologists who went out and kind of developed methods for us to understand that. And that includes Lyndon Hargrave, who first went out and compiled all of the scarlet macaw instances of scarlet macaws that have been found throughout the Southwest by literally going from museum to museum to museum and publishing that in the 1970s. He is an ornithologist, one of the first archaeoornithologists. That is a career if you work with birds and do archaeology, so if there are people out there that are interested. he was one of the first, published a volume on that. Charmian McCusick also, who just passed a couple years ago, unfortunately, was one of Lyndon Hargrave's students, who also has gone out and done these kind of ornithological studies at many different archaeological sites, compiled a ton of information about how birds are important to indigenous communities here in the area. And we draw really, really heavily, I draw really, really heavily in this presentation and the work that I do on both of their work. And then this is Birds of the Sun, which I will plug endlessly. This is the volume that we were working on together with a whole host of collaborators whose work I also draw on. So this is not just to plug it, it's to say that the ideas I'm presenting today are in no way my own, but they're ideas that have been developed through groups of people working on this for years and years. So, so that's where a lot of this knowledge is coming from. Now, I won't go in too much detail about this, but theoretical perspectives. It was instilled in me as a graduate student that we always have to have theoretical perspectives and think about this thing from a larger, what's the larger paradigm that we're working in. And the work that I did, the work that I began, really came out of work that was being done looking at interregional interaction, right? And for a long time in archaeology, especially in southwestern archaeology, there are a lot of people who were great archaeologists who were looking at this idea that, like, you have these great civilizations in Mesoamerica, you have these great civilizations in the US Southwest and Mexican Northwest. They really seem to be pretty similar in some ways. What are they similar? Are they the same people? Are they people that moved all across the landscape? What was going on there? And from that came a really, really detailed look at, what are the objects that we find that come from these other places, right? What are the Mesoamerican objects found in the Southwest? What are the Southwest objects found in Mesoamerica? And over 100 years, people have been really working through those questions and those ideas, right? And how we do archaeology has changed a lot in that time. And the question that it's led me to is one that I think is kind of wholly different and hopefully a little more humanistic than looking straight at these objects, which is not to say that the perspectives that people had in the past are bad, but that we've really developed, I think, from trying to document, and you'll see an example of the turquoise trade, people trying to map sources of turquoise and how turquoise made its way from parts of the Southwest into Mesoamerica, and then kind of the mapping of these different exchange routes of how people were trading objects and moving objects on the landscape. And what we're really starting to find, right, is that if you kind of ignore this humanistic side of it, the people and the birds and how you can move these objects, you start to kind of miss some of the larger details that you might have been looking at when you're just trying to document objects in different kinds of places. And so that's kind of the perspective that we're working toward here, and I'll get into that a little bit as we go on. And one of the perspectives that got us into thinking about macaws specifically, right? They're people who initially started documenting those instances. The other thing that I really, really want to highlight and hammer home is that macaws remain important to indigenous communities today. Very, very important. And they are not something that just existed in the past or that was, important to people a long time ago. They remain very important to people. And we've had the pleasure and the honor of working closely with Octavia Siotua, who's a Zuni traditional knowledge keeper, who contributed a chapter to the volume that we've worked on. And he has told us some really interesting and shared some really interesting stories about how macaw and raven eggs are part of the Zuni origin story. That there were the people of summer and the people of winter, and the people of winter selected, this very plain egg that hatched, or the people of winter selected a turquoise colored egg that hatched to become a raven and chased them into the winter, and they became modern day Zuni people. And the people of summer basically chose this very plain egg that hatched to become a scarlet macaw and took people to the south into the lands of summer, and they became kind of the summer people, right? So this is like at a critical juncture in Zuni history. Scarlet macaws and ravens, right, are very critical parts of that. That's very interesting, given that there are, of course, no scarlet macaws in the Southwest that occur naturally. We also know that the largest clan at Zuni is the Macaw clan, and the sun priest, the position of sun priest, one of very, very important for traditional knowledge, is must be, I think, a Macaw clan member who takes that position. And then macaws and feathers, also very important in curing rituals, specific dances, different kinds of events and things like that, but not in prayer sticks, although they are important in prayer sticks and for other communities. And then Peter Whiteley also contributes a great chapter, talks a little bit how macaws and parrots are pivotal and pervasive in Pueblo myth, ritual, and social structure. And he also cites the story of the macaw and raven eggs as part of the Zuni origin tradition. They're aligned with things like the sun, south, right? Not very surprising, right? Given their red appearance and homeland in the south. Squash flowers, spondylus shells, coral, and the color red. So all things that really have this bright coloration. and that their significance cross-cuts Pueblo language groups today, despite sustained colonial repression of indigenous rituals. So what we're looking at is a really strong form of resistance, right? In that these birds have remained important to people for so long, and that these traditions continually are passed on in spite of, right, the oppression from colonialism over long periods of time. And he also talks about the Hopi parrot macaw clan as the only clan named after a non-native plant or animal, right? So very important to people. I'm going to show an image of a beautiful macaw feather garment. Is one of the only things like this that has been found. It was preserved in a cave near the edge of the cedars in the Four Corners area. And then I also want to show up a close-up of the scarlet macaw feathers. You can see they're iridescent, very beautiful, and they kind of shimmer if you've ever seen them up close. And of course, one of the things that I think, until we really worked on this book, that hadn't kind of come across in the literature is exactly what we were talking about before, that scarlet macaws are really like social animals, right? They can be very fun, they can be very mean. They're always very non-compliant. They break out of cages, they mess with people, they mess with your hair and make you look unkempt. And these are things we think about in the past, right? If you're transporting a macaw, what's it going to be like, right? It's going to be hard. It's not going to be fun. And you'd need to be bonded to that bird, and that bird would need to trust you, and you'd have to have a relationship there, right? So they're not something you can just like get to the next town, hand off your macaw to that person, and have them take it to another town, right? If you're going to transport a macaw, you have to be the one transporting that macaw from start to finish, because it won't go so well if you just give that bird to someone and they shove it in a box or something like that and then take it on. They'll be pretty unhappy. They're capable of course, interacting with humans. They can solve puzzles and do all kinds of interesting things. They get out of cage locking mechanisms all the time. They are also capable of mimicking human speech. So you can teach them to say hello when people enter the room, to say goodbye when you're leaving. You can teach them to wave at you and do all these kind of interesting things. And they have pretty big alphabets, vocabularies. And so there's lots of stories of archaeologists and as well as people working in indigenous communities meeting macaws that can speak Zuni, for instance, and respond to people and stuff. Along with ravens and crows, they also have really advanced cognitive abilities. So it's not just that they're capable of mimicking human speech, but they're also quite a bit smarter than most birds out there and most animals out there in like brain size relative to body size. So now that I've gotten through all that, this is the central question that motivated some of this work, right? I've told you that there's all these macaws found at these sites here in the US Southwest and Mexican Northwest. And so I was interested, how did it come to be that scarlet macaws are central to indigenous cosmologies in daily life hundreds of miles from their endemic homelands, right? How did this happen? What is the series of events that led this to be? And the first question we had was, right, if these birds came from parts of Mesoamerica, were they, and thinking about them, adopted from Mesoamerica, right? That seems to be like the easiest. It's like, oh, okay, people went down, saw people in Mesoamerica, and maybe brought them back up, and with them brought back these ideas of macaws. And this is not so far-fetched because if you follow the literature on Mesoamerican Southwest interaction, one of the big things that people talk about is cacao, a chocolate drink that was brought to a site called Pueblo Bonito that we'll talk about a little bit later, right? And with cacao came not just the beans and the drink itself, but also the cylindrical vessels that they were used to prepare it, right? So to create this frothing beverage that people then consumed that had psychedelic properties, and it was a very important thing for a very specific time. But it really seems like people went down there, found this beverage, and brought it back wholesale, or a group of enterprising people went down there and brought it back. So did the same thing happen with macaws? That was kind of our first question. So we went to Mesoamerica and started looking at how people treated scarlet macaws in Mesoamerica, and we found that they appear in the ethnohistories and the codices. I have a couple images from the codices up in the far left corner, and down here is the Matricula de Tributos. And they appear, you can see the third bird from the left at the very top is depicting a scarlet macaw. And down here in the right, you can see actually these are red feathers that indicate that macaw feathers were being transported taken in as tributes by the Aztec Empire in certain times and places. We see that mythically they're associated with the sun. They're important to people, and actually whether or not this is a connection or not, but one of the principal deities of the Maya is called Seven Macaw. This deity is not often depicted as a macaw, so it may not have been a macaw, right? But it has the name of a macaw. And then materially, of course, we see the use of feathers in producing headdresses and clothing and garments and attire and things like that people were wearing. We also see them depicted in clay and stone and ceramic iconography, as well as painted images. And you see a couple examples here. One of those is a ball court, the little hoop through which the ball must go in the ball game that you can see with a macaw depicted on it. And then this is a vessel from Sayula on the west coast of Mexico, and pottery from the west coast of Mexico, also depicting birds that really look like macaws, right, with the big white kind of gap for the eye and distinctive beaks. But when we looked for evidence of the skeletal remains of macaws, this is all that we could find. It's just a handful of occurrences, right? And you might be thinking to yourself, wow, that adds up to be something like, I don't know, not quite 20, which is very different from 750 or more, right? So you're kind of looking at some very different patterns. And these sites also, you may note, range from 2000 BCE to 1520 CE, right? So a huge span of time, thousands of years, far larger than the span of time that we have in the U.S. Southwest and Mexican Northwest. So there's some pretty serious differences. There's also, there are a lot of sites here. There are many more sites, I think, spread throughout all of Mexico and Central America. And so there's, you're really starting to look at okay, they may not have been quite as important. Of course, how many of those sites have been excavated, how much do we know about that is a totally different question. But what we do find is that the importance of scarlet macaws in Mesoamerica does not seem to have transported wholesale into the U.S. Southwest and Mexican Northwest. There seems to be some other patterns going on. So we struck out that theory. And then became interested in trying to get at, are there patterns in their acquisition, circulation, and deposition that could help answer this question, right? Can we look internally at the U.S. Southwest and Mexican Northwest and try to get a better idea of what specifically is going on with these birds that might inform our understanding of why they're important and how they endured for so long? So this is just kind of a quick list of instances of scarlet macaws that we have in the Southwest, pre-1250 and post-1250. There's not much to call out here. I'm going to focus specifically on Chaco Canyon, Flagstaff, and Paqui May, and that's why I have those bolded here. And I will also show you a map, right? See, these are some of the sites that have the most scarlet macaws, in areas that have the most scarlet macaws. I'll show you this on a map, too. This is kind of the distribution. You definitely have some focused in different areas, the Mimbres region, southern Arizona. They seem to be geographically distributed in kind of even ways, but there weren't any clear hints from this about what really might be going on. They kind of appear almost everywhere in different times and places, although it does seem to be a little more patterned pre-1250. And what I became interested in specifically was looking at scarlet macaws at these very large regional centers. One of the first patterns that kind of popped out was that they really seemed to be focused at a handful of different sites. And those sites are really Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, Wapaki in the Flagstaff area, and Paqui May in northwestern Chihuahua. And I also say Mogollon Highlands here because there are 4 sites in the Mogollon Highlands region that also have 20 or more, somewhere around 20 or more, not all of them had that many, but macaws, which is kind of anomalous. And they're also, I won't go into detail, but they're also inhabited between 1300 and 1500 too. So it's a really tight, kind of interesting time span for them. So, but anyway, one of the things that, as I was kind of looking into this work and thinking about it more critically, I hypothesized that maybe macaw acquisition may have aided in social cohesion and bringing people together. So you have these large regional centers that are established at the center of kind of these regional networks. And so you need some kind of mechanism for people living in these villages who have maybe lived in more disparate settlement types and settlement structures over time to come together and for them all to kind of buy into this living in this one place, right? That's much larger than kind of the other places they lived in other times. And so scarlet macaws may have aided in that, in creating social cohesion amongst people. The ability to acquire one may have kind of aided in that process. And then the other thing is that the role that these birds have in creating a really unique and powerful place. And I'll talk about this a little bit as we get a little further down. But sites that have macaws, that have these big, beautiful red birds, access to their feathers, people, leaders who can communicate with birds would be different, right, from a site that didn't have someone who was communicating with an animal, that didn't have birds that could have flown overhead and been really, really loud, because they are really, really loud. It would have created a unique social experience for the people living in some of these sites. Okay, so these are the three centers. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these three centers. These are the three centers that I was looking at in their location. Again, Pueblo Bonito, Wapaki, and Paki May. This is where they are relative to the distribution of Scarlet Macaws. They're all inhabited kind of in a sequence, which was really nice to help make comparisons between them. Starting with Pueblo Bonito between 900 and 1150, Wapaki between 1080 and 1275, and then Paki May a little bit later on in the sequence between 1200 and 1450. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about Pueblo Bonito. It is a 650-room great house in Chaco Canyon. It's the center of a really expansive long-distance exchange network. There's road and irrigation systems, and it's also the center of the much larger Chaco and regional system that extends all the way into like central Arizona and all throughout the northwestern New Mexico area. And so I looked at where do the macaws appear at these sites? What's going on with that? Are there patterns that we can get, that we can look at? And this is kind of what we found, right? There's 35 macaws and thick-billed parrots from Pueblo Bonito. These are recovered primarily from rooms, as well as a kiva in the trash mound, and you can see their distribution here. Really interestingly, this arc of sites, it doesn't really look like much, but the arc of sites that starts at the first red site, room 38 up there, and extends all the way down to Kiva J, down here on the bottom right, is the oldest and oldest and earliest arc of sites that was constructed at Pueblo Bonito. So there was a time, you see all these sites laid out here, there was a time when that was the only, those handful of like 50 sites or 40 rooms was the only part of Pueblo Bonito. So it seems like the birds being restricted to that area, they're obviously, well, they're not obviously. We went in to look at carbon-14, do radiocarbon dating of some of those birds, and found that they actually precede these like very grand sequences of construction that we see, and they're actually even earlier than we thought they were, around the year 800. So not only were they procured at that time and living at that time, but they also were deposited very specifically in those rooms, which seems to be very intentional. It's very clear that there's very restricted access to these rooms as well. A lot of them are closed off, especially later in the sequence. A lot of these rooms were closed off and not returned to. There were people buried, not necessarily in these rooms specifically, but in the rooms adjacent to room 38 right up there in the center. There are people buried that seem to have been very important people living at Chaco Canyon that have very substantial deposits buried alongside them. And I won't talk too much about that, but that seems to be pretty important. One of the things that zooarchaeologists have worked on, my friend Dr. Kate Bishop specifically, has worked on here at Chaco Canyon is looking at modifications on macaw bones. One way we can find, when we're looking at animal bones, how they were used is by looking at how they've been modified. So if there's cut marks and things like that, it's usually evidence that people have been pulling bones apart, right? Basically disarticulating the skeletons and using tools to do it so that they could probably cook or roast or eat the meat that's associated with them. There are no modifications at all on macaw bones at Chaco Canyon, which is very interesting because there are lots of modifications on turkey bones and other different kinds of birds that you see. So it seems really clear that these birds were probably buried whole, not like cut up or anything like that or consumed in any way. They really seem to have been buried whole. And I also want to point out that there was one room in there, room 38, that I keep mentioning up at the very top, that was what the excavators called an aviary. They found the remains of 12 to 14 birds basically piled in bird guano at the bottom of the room. So it seems like people have been keeping these birds in this very restricted room, maybe only a couple people being able to access them. And at some point, they left this room or allowed the birds, the birds themselves kind of died and fell directly onto the floor, and that was where they ended up buried. And the room was probably closed off shortly after that. So some interesting patterns that start to emerge, certainly in how people are treating these birds. And the last thing I will say is that a lot of the work that Dr. Bishop and another colleague, Dr. Sam Flad, have worked on looking at this has indicated that a lot of the burials that we see of macaws, which are almost all full and whole, which does not occur in other times and places, really seem to be associated with construction, occupation, or closure rites, right? So the opening of a room or the closing off of a room, the birds may have been deposited there when that happened. Okay, so moving now, shifting our focus into central Arizona, I looked at the site of Wapaki in the Flagstaff area. Wapaki is an incredible site. If you're ever up in the Flagstaff area and haven't been up there before, I highly, highly recommend it. It's really fun, and it's really beautiful too. But it's a 100-room pueblo located 50 kilometers northeast of Flagstaff. It was inhabited after the eruption of Sunset Crater around 1080 to 1090, which is just to the south of the site. Also a beautiful thing to check out in a national park if you go up there. And so basically all this ash deposited in the area that made the land much more arable than it had been. The soil was able to retain moisture. So a lot of people left actually the northern Phoenix Basin area, Anthem and New River, and moved up there is what we think happened, bringing with them a lot of the traits and characteristics that we typically associated with Phoenix Basin Hohokam. Which makes it this really interesting frontier zone because the Chaco regional system extended into this area as well. So you have things like turquoise and macaws and copper bells being brought in from Chaco and rooms being built in a Chacoan manner as room blocks, but you also have people from the Phoenix area bringing with them the knowledge of the ball game and different kinds of architectural forms and pottery vessels and things like that. And it kind of all meshes in the Flagstaff area, which makes it really, really interesting. And so looking at the macaws themselves, this is the southern room block. There's two room blocks that are built directly into the bedrock at Wapaki. This is the southernmost room block. And in it and in the surrounding area, we find 42 to 44 macaws and 3 to 5 thick-billed parrots. Now, many of these are lacking contextual information, and I will not get up on my soapbox and say, no, this was excavated during the Works Progress Administration in the 1920s and 30s. And so what happened was a lot of people were put to work going to work at archaeological sites, and what inevitably happened was that a lot of materials, and these projects were done on such a large scale that sometimes the focus was not necessarily on recovering every animal bone that they could find. It was more so on moving as much dirt as they can and reconstructing these walls and things like that so they wouldn't fall. So we end up with not a lot of contextual information for where these birds came from. Obviously, we know some of the rooms that they came from, but a lot of the birds end up with these strange contexts that we really haven't been able to put them back together with, which is kind of unfortunate. Now, one thing you'll see really quickly is that the central core of the site, kind of around room 38 and 41, that is the earliest inhabited part of the site and also an area that emulated Chaco-style masonry. So they built rooms of a characteristic style that looks just like the styles that they have at Chaco Canyon. Whether or not it was Chacoan people coming down here and doing that is kind of another story, but it certainly seems to have been emulated. And those do seem to be a lot of the rooms where the macaws are from that have solid contexts. Again, like at Chaco Canyon, we see very little modification on macaw bone. Next to none. I did this analysis myself, but I didn't get a chance to really fully go into it, but I observed next to none as I was doing some of this work. And then the other thing we see is that macaws are given treatments and offerings that are afforded to humans and other animals that seem to be really important to people. So in room 35, for example, yes, room 35. In room 35, for example, you find it's tough to explain because it's got kind of 4 layers. There's 3 rooms that all kind of collapse onto one another. What we find in some of the very low layers in room 35 is that at least 2, maybe probably actually 5 macaws have been buried wrapped in matting alongside dogs, a couple dogs, very young macaws, that were also wrapped in matting alongside a human burial, a child burial that had also been kind of put into a similar context. Now, they're not exactly lined up, and I don't know whether we'd be able to say, that these are all kind of associated with one another. But what I've argued is that room 35 certainly seems to be somewhere that people are returning to periodically, and seems to be of significance for macaws because there are layers above that where you find more and more macaws buried. So, more generally, I think it's very interesting that macaws are kind of given this treatment that's typically afforded to humans and to some dogs as well. And I've argued that there's association with the room closure and then revisiting over time. Okay, so next, we're going to move to the site of Paquimé in northwestern Chihuahua. Has anyone been to Paquimé? Have people been to Paquimé? I know at least a couple of people have been to Paquimé. Okay, if you only go to one archaeological site for the rest of your life, skip all of the other ones and go to Pakime, because it is the most incredible site. I think the most incredible site in the entire world. Just so incredibly interesting, really incredible landscape, and what people have found in this site is just, I think, extraordinary. It is a 1,000 to 2,000 room Pueblo-style settlement in the Casas Grandes, at the center of the Casas Grandes region in northwestern Chihuahua. We see the mixing and the merging of traditionally Southwest and traditionally Mesoamerican architectural styles and material culture. You see these really immense collections of non-local materials, especially shell, but also, macaws and other kinds of things that people have brought in from different places, and it's been called stockpiling, right? That people are really, really bringing in tons and tons of this stuff. And then really extensive macaw and turkey avicultural systems with up to 950 or more total birds, of which 500, just over 500, are either scarlet military or indeterminate macaws. So how many there are has kind of been called into question by Mike Whalen. If you really want to get in the weeds, there's a great chapter about this in Birds of the Sun, where he argues that he thinks there's quite a few less birds than initially thought. But regardless, 126 is still far more than any of the sites that we've looked at previously in the Southwest and Mexican Northwest. And this is really, we think that people were breeding these birds. It's really hard to breed. It's really hard to transport scarlet macaws. It's really hard to breed scarlet macaws. And we think that people were probably managing to do that. We have great evidence that people were actually doing that at Pakime, right? So we can say archaeologically we have really secure evidence that this was something that was probably happening. I skipped one here. What we find at Pakime and looking at the distribution of the birds throughout the site is that they are ubiquitous in the plazas and rooms, and as well as in these adobe macaw pens that are specific to this site. One of these houses, I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's actually called the House of the Macaw. This is a name that Charles de Peso, who initially led the excavations and working at Pakime, had called it because there were so many macaws found in this, and I'll show you an example of that in just a sec. They're most often deposited in subfloor bird burials beneath plazas, and you really see keeping and burial patterns that are uncommon elsewhere in the Southwest, Northwest, right? It really seems to be on a totally different scale.
May I have your attention, please? Can I have Brittany Lurch come to the front desk, please? Brittany Lurch to the front desk, please.
Where were we? We also see evidence for healed pathologies. We haven't done, the work has not been done to look at bone modification, but one thing we do see is that a lot of these birds have breaks and things like that that healed over time, which indicates that someone was caring for them, right? In the wild, the birds would not make it if they had broken a limb or something like that, and they really seem to be doing that here. And like I was saying, the bone modification needs new study, and that's something we're working on very slowly, but we're working on it. And these are some of the examples. This is Plaza 312 in what's called the House of the Macaws. And you can see these bird pens, and I'll show you a closer up to highlight them, right? But these are pens that macaws were kept in, ostensibly throughout their lives. They were called breeding boxes, I believe. They were initially called, they thought that people were keeping them in there and living in there. The argument De Peso made. What they actually look like are the nesting bins in which you keep very young macaws. They're actually the exact same size as the bins that people who are raising macaws will put young macaws in, and they'll kind of rear them from these little bins. And what we think, we the archaeologists years later think, is not so much that birds were breeding in these boxes, but they had young birds in these boxes that were being raised and being protected from the elements and kept warm through moving hot water underneath them and other kinds of methods. So, and this is a reconstruction of what those look like. They have these really iconic cage stones, and you'll see a couple examples of them. This is a picture of from when they were doing the excavations. I think that's actually Charles de Peso in the white hat on the right side there. But this is one of the pictures from when they were doing this work, and it kind of depicts what the archaeologists excavated as they were doing it. So, really incredible patterns that we see here. So to tie this up, and actually to bring in some other ideas that I'm just going to cover quickly, I mentioned that I'd done archaeological chemistry work, and so I'm going to distill some of the things that we found in looking at macaw bone tissue. And one of the things that we found from looking at light-stable isotopes, carbon, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen, is that these macaws were fed diets almost entirely of C4 plants, likely corn. In everywhere we've tested them, we found that their diets are almost entirely C4, which differs actually from turkeys that are kept by people who actually will scavenge and go out. And sometimes turkeys that are found at the exact same site, right, will have these diets that they'll go in and they'll get wild and C3 plants and stuff they can find out there and not be fed maize. But it really seems like the preference was to feed them maize and maize only. In looking at strontium isotopes, which are indicative of where these birds were raised, we find that they were entirely raised locally at Chaco in the Flagstaff area, and then most of the birds that we've only sampled a subsection of the ones from Paquimé, most of those are raised locally, although some of those birds appear to have been raised in the surrounding regions, in the Casas Grandes area, northwestern Chihuahua, and one of those birds actually may have been raised from a northern site, somewhere up to the north, and then of course some of them have values that indicate that they're probably pretty close to other parts of Mesoamerica and were imported. So most of these sites seem to be raising these birds locally. Paquimé seems to be bringing in birds from extra regional locations too. And then there's another group that has been working on that I'm also tangentially related to and kind of a part of, that's looking at DNA. And one of the things they're interested in is the relatedness of these birds. And what they have found is that these birds are so closely genetically related that there must have been a founding pair of scarlet macaws that were brought to the Southwest, from which every bird that has been found in the Southwest has been descended from. So that means that people are either going to the exact same place and procuring the same family of birds over hundreds and hundreds of years, or they probably brought a pair of birds somewhere closer to the Southwest, and someone was managing that population over a really, really long period of time and giving people birds and trading birds in that area. So we're still working on that one, and we actually are very close to having and publishing some new information looking at the nuclear DNA. This is all from mitochondrial DNA. You can learn a lot more from nuclear DNA about population dynamics and things like that. So we're kind of about to come up with that information. If you invite me back in 2 years, I might have some even more interesting things to say about it. if I pass tonight. So some really, really interesting things from looking at some of these different technical methods and things like that. And for me, these patterns, and for the people I'm working with on this, these patterns really point to a novel breeding program for scarlet macaws that was far outside of the endemic habitat of those birds. This program was developed to provide these highly important macaws and their byproducts to people who were really, really far from the region in which they occur naturally. We think it probably was supplemented over time by acquiring scarlet macaws, as we may see at Paquimé. But really what we're seeing is that people are raising these birds way outside of their natural endemic habitat. And I have made the argument in many different places that one of the most critically important roles that these birds had was with placemaking, right? Was with establishing a place that's important and unique and different, right? And you think of a site like Paquimé, where there's hundreds of birds, and you think of what it might have looked like, what it might have sounded like, right? These birds are incredibly loud. They all call kind of in unison in the mornings and the evenings. People could have heard that from miles and miles away. They could have been flying overhead, right? You could have seen a site off in the distance, and there's red birds that are huge that don't look like anything else, right? That are flying overhead, that then would land in parts of the town and be able to communicate with people, right? So it kind of creates this really unique social experience that people in other places and times may not have been able to experience. So I also wanted to talk just a little bit, not too much, because I want to connect this a little bit to some of the patterns we're seeing here in Phoenix and in the ancestral O'odham area, right? So of course, when you have these great and interesting patterns, you look at these northern southwest sites and Paquimé as well, you come up with this really cool pattern. Then of course there has to be a region that totally bucks the trend, and you're like, wow, what do we do with this? And that region is southern Arizona, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I don't know, it makes it really interesting and something we want to keep looking into. So far fewer macaws coming from southern Arizona in those time periods. Here's what that looks like really briefly. And we actually have scarlet macaws at Sotavaki, which is really interesting. It is, of course, a large regional center, right? The center of this really, really extensive kind of larger community. And we found 2 scarlet macaws at the site. This is where they're located in what's called a storage room right here. They were also recovered in the 1930s with very little information about them. And we managed to take a second look at them just recently, and a different group had dated these birds to between 1045 and 1215, which is kind of interesting, around the time of Wapaki. And when we got to take a second look at the birds just, I think, 3 months ago, we actually found maybe 15 additional macaw elements, bones, while we were kind of doing that work, and pulled out a bunch of turkey bones and other kinds of things that had been previously documented as rabbit bones, which I guess is what happens when you have someone who's not a zooarchaeologist, someone who works with animals, doing this kind of analysis. So we were able to pull those out, and we're now working really closely with Salt River and Gila River, O'odham communities here in the valley, to look into the significance of these birds and how they kind of figure into the song series about macaws that they have. And I don't want to talk too much about it because it's something that has yet to go into consultation and for us to have a larger discussion about. But to sum that up, Southern Arizona is interestingly really not like patterns you see elsewhere in the Southwest Northwest. The large regional centers do not contain the most macaws. There are a few macaws per site, 1 or 2. They're distributed amongst various different kinds of site types. You also get thick-billed parrots and military macaws in numbers that you really don't see in other parts of the Southwest. Much smaller scale operations or shorter durations of macaw keeping, maybe pulses and not like these really larger programs. But interestingly, we do find that they have that same close genetic relationship to the birds found in other areas. So even so, people in these areas seem to have been procuring birds that were from the same kind of founding population, or from the same population that people were getting them elsewhere. So, like I said, we're now working really closely with the local tribal historic preservation offices to move forward these discussions and kind of learn a little bit more. And again, if you bring me back in like 2 years, maybe we can talk a little bit about that, and that could be kind of interesting. So I think that these patterns kind of illustrate a really important point. The acquisition and use of macaws in the Southwest Northwest really share some central threads. You see the deposition in rooms and plazas. You see treatments that are similar to humans in preparation for the afterlife that are consistent over time and space. But you certainly do seem to see different interpretations by different groups of people living in different areas, which is, perhaps not unsurprising, right? We oftentimes will paint all people are kind of these Southwestern people. It's easier for us as archaeologists to say that, when the reality is not true, right? People are going to have different patterns that they adopt in different times and places. So how did their significance last until today? One critical item is that it seems to have continued over time and space. There always seems to be people keeping macaws, even if it occurred in different parts of the Southwest Northwest and happened at kind of vastly different scales, right? Contrasting the Wapaki maybe and the Southern Arizona. And so from an outside perspective, it might seem strange that non-local Scarlet Macaws are found in the arid Southwest Northwest, which is really far from their endemic habitat. But from an archaeological and indigenous perspective, macaw acquisition and keeping and maybe even breeding over hundreds of years have really interwoven macaws into the origin stories and songs and traditional histories that continue to be passed down today. And I really like to close with Octavius Seotua's words here to highlight. And he says, when a ceremonial bird like a macaw dies at Zuni, it's treated like a member of the family with food offerings and prayer meal placed with it for its use in the afterlife, right? That these birds were and truly members of people's families and continue to have that familial importance to people today. And again, I like to highlight this to say that we're kind of constantly learning more about the significance of macaws by working with descendant communities. And so we're trying to more and more, I think, put their voices to the forefront and listen to what they have to say and kind of sort out, how does that work, what fits with the archaeological record. And it's kind of interesting because I think we've gotten to a place where it's like, I've kind of said all I have to say about this topic from an archaeological perspective. And so a lot of the work we're doing now is with descendant communities to say, okay, what are the parts of the stories that you guys have to tell and that you want to tell and can tell that would really take this work to the next level. So if you are interested in this topic or any of the topics that were discussed today, check out Birds of the Sun. It's just a great book. If you have family members, Christmas is coming up. It's a great gift. It's a great Christmas gift. I know my parents have a couple copies, and I'm sure they read them all the time. No, if you're interested in this, check it out. We also did revisiting Birds of the Southwest. If you're like, bird interested but don't want to spend like $40, this is like a $5 to $10 purchase instead, and it has a lot of those topics and is very, very interesting and written for public audiences as well. So Okay, like I said, this research doesn't happen in a vacuum. These are all the people, not all the people, these are some of the people probably, and there are many, many more that have really contributed to this, whose ideas I have stolen and feel great about doing so, and borrowed with their approval, of course, and shared in this presentation. And I would like to thank you all for hanging in there, and I'd be happy to answer some questions if people have them.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that fantastic presentation. And I think someone that is very interested in bird watching, I gotta say that was the cutest and most colorful presentation that we had in this speaker series. So we have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. I just ask you to use the microphone if you have a question. So.
To be breeding scarlets, you need a huge flight cage. So do you have evidence, post holes, etc.? And you also need sunlight because they need vitamin D like we need vitamin D. So what do you have?
We don't have that. We have, well, again, there's the breeding boxes that DePeso kind of noted are the closest evidence of that. We have repurposed rooms, something like this aviary at Chaco Canyon, although that would not have had, it's unlikely to have had a lot of access to sunlight. And I think the reasons that you bring up are probably the reasons why a lot of these birds were not making it past a year of age.
But they were breeding them.
But they do seem to have been breeding them. They have.
The genetic closeness
Yes.
is pretty convincing.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I don't know what to make of it.
Yeah.
I often wondered, though, why they didn't just bring feathers from the south up to Chaco, et cetera. And the reason is probably the same reason we think that they'd make good pets.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, the feathers, so much easier to carry feathers than it is to carry a macaw.
Also, you know what also has always interested me, and I found one digging a site at the base of Mount Eldon, right near Eldon Pueblo back in 1974. The little Mexican, what I always thought of as food dogs, the squat little corn-eating, short-legged dogs. You find them up north too.
Yeah.
So I guess they're traveling with those only, but they probably lived a while.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like it.
Yeah. Oh, well, very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Okay, this has changed my total perspective about what I knew, which is not a lot. So the bird itself was revered, sacred, well cared for. When the bird died, or several birds, whatever, did they use the feathers as a resource, or woven blankets, or the example you showed of an apron? Is that pretty common or not?
Yes, almost certainly. And we could have probably assumed that a lot of the harm that was done to the birds that may have resulted in them living short lives was because they were being plucked pretty consistently.
I was wondering
Yeah,
if that,
and
yeah.
so when
okay.
they're buried in these cysts, and the size of the cysts, right, the size of the long tail feathers, I should have brought one, I have one, a couple, but the size of the tail feathers are like, up to two feet
Okay.
or longer. So if you're burying a live bird, the size of the burial pit is going to be about this big, and it was not. Almost all of them were like this big, right? So it looks like they were probably plucked completely and then deposited.
Wow, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then the strontium isotopes, are you getting those from the bones? Or?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
That's from the
okay.
bones directly. And there's a whole, I will not talk ad nauseum about that process that we went through to
Okay.
extract some strontium from those bones. But I would happily talk to you about it after this so that everyone doesn't have to listen to it. But yeah, strontium is taken up in the environment. Strontium exists in the environment. It's indicative of underlying bedrock in different areas, which has different ages and different compositions throughout the world. And so if you eat local, you will then take trace amounts of strontium into your bones, and that's how you can look at, okay, do the strontium values within these bird bones match the local signature in that area, or are they from somewhere else, kind of thing.
Okay. Strontium.
Mm-hmm. Radiogenic strontium, yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Birds have a tendency naturally to shed feathers, and sometimes you find them in nesting areas and just in everywhere. I can testify to that myself. I'm around my house, but were these feathers from Scarlet Macaws or other colorful birds or important birds gathered up naturally as opposed to capturing and collecting the birds? Were they gathered up for use for trade or for ceremonies or whatever?
It seems like people were plucking them while they were alive. Now, it's hard to say, and I'll tell you why it seems that way. It's hard to say. Some birds that are not in good condition will just lose a lot of feathers and look pretty rough if they're in poor health. We have evidence of feather plucking. There's actually bone evidence of feather plucking in some birds that I have a colleague who was at the University of Florida who had looked at this in their dissertation, and she basically found that there were these kind of bone signatures of feather plucking, right? If you're pulling these feathers off, it results in kind of these abnormalities on the bone that you can look at and see and observe on bird ulnas. And so we have that evidence. There's a story, there's a footnote in the volume on excavation of Pueblo Bonito, where Neil Judd, the excavator, writes about going to Zuni and a bird that he had given, I think, to the Zunis, and they had gone to see the bird, and within 2 or 3 years of seeing the bird was missing most of its feathers, but knew the name of almost all of the Zuni elders and could respond to them in Zuni, which is really interesting. But he notes in a later footnote that 2 years later that bird had dropped dead and that they were asking for a new bird.
Well, I wasn't thinking so much of captured birds in pens as natural areas of the forest or wherever where they gathered that way.
Oh, so in Mexico or from their natural habitat.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, so you would think so. That would be my assumption. And if gun to my head, someone said you need to sort out what happened here, what was going on with these birds, my suggestion would be that there were probably families of bird keepers that we have ethnographic evidence for, that there were these families kind of living out on the landscape, that was what they did. They kept birds and cared for birds. And that people in the Southwest were either, there were families that were living in the Southwest that were keeping those birds and had facilities for kind of keeping birds and that people would continuously go back to. But I would guess that they were somewhere probably in northern Mexico along that kind of transport line that were somewhat easily accessible from people we know were moving pretty substantially on the landscape and could go and procure them from there. But that, in my mind, is how do you reconcile this? All these birds are genetically related with over almost 1,000 years. People kind of getting birds from the same people, and it's that's about it. Unless again they were going to the forests and procuring the same family of birds, which seems pretty unlikely. So, yeah.
Do you guys, when you guys have looked at, the actual skeletons of the macaws, do you guys ever see any, differences in each skeleton? Kind of, you mentioned that they only live for about a year or so. Do you see any, adaptations that are not seen on earlier, or, earlier generations of the macaws?
We don't see generational changes that birds later in time have some kind of different developments that maybe birds earlier in time don't have. But we do see, you can see kind of the different morphological characteristics that indicate the age of the bird and that they're aging over time. Now, this question, Hargrave, who did this initial work, we've kind of called into question some of his methods. But in Birds of the Sun, we actually had an ornithologist and the same colleague, the University of Florida that I was talking about, put a chapter together looking at okay, let's go talk to some people out there and see what we can figure out about aging these birds and put them into categories that make a little bit more sense. Hargrave was kind of operating without a couple. He was doing a comparative study, but he was missing a couple of the age brackets, and so he was using other species of macaws to fill in those age brackets of similar sizes, which could work, certainly, and we don't have any reason to believe that he was wildly off, but isn't maybe not the most perfect way that you could do the study. So we've introduced some new age characteristics and classifications that are more indicative of kind of the stages, the developmental stages for the birds, that kind of describe, here's what we see at each of these different kinds of stages. So, but yeah, we definitely see morphological changes over time and size changes, of course, in the bone over time.
What do
you want to continue?
Yeah.
it's just one more question, promise. What is the oldest macaw you guys have been able to find, like, in that site as a whole?
So oldest is in the earliest in time that we've been able to date? Or
No,
the
like
age?
oldest, like age-wise, like that. What's it called? Like,
How-
or
how
did they
old the bird
all
is.
just die about a year?
There are, if you trust Hargrave, his cutoff kind of stops at 4. So like you have all macaws over the age of 4 have similar characteristics. And so we have found breeding age birds. And you were asking earlier about, how do you know that they're breeding? It's like, okay, well, is there at least one bird that we found at the site that's of breeding age, or that we think is of breeding age? And so there are a handful of sites where we do have that, and that's something we're always kind of looking for. But yeah, we don't really know, it's like 4 and above is kind of the characteristic we have, so we really don't know how long that bird might have lived.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
One more? Anyone else?
I'll tell you, especially under stressed conditions.
Yeah.
These birds will talk.
Yeah.
And I, not only macaws, but many other parrots too. I myself have seen a macaw, Scarlet,
Yeah.
with not a feather on its body,
Yeah.
except for on its head, because it was living under such stressful conditions.
Yeah.
So maybe they just kept them and let them pluck themselves.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
So you, like in your presentation, you had the trade routes that line up with like the turquoise. How do the macaw trade line up with like obsidian and shell and other items?
That's a really good question. This is kind of like an active question right now that people have lots of strong feelings about. And I won't say that we're enmeshed in a battle right now, but we're certainly in a scholarly discourse with someone else who feels very strongly that these birds were coming from West Mexico. And I want that to be true. Like, I want it to be true that the birds were transported from West Mexico and into the Southwest. But all the evidence that we have is that they were really being raised locally, probably in the Southwest. Still looking for, huh? Yeah, right? So anyway, all the evidence that we have is really that they were being raised on a pretty local scale. And so, I don't know. It would be very interesting to see that they come from West Mexico. So much stuff comes from West Mexico. You have red on buff pottery over time. You have cacao coming through there. You have people trading all along the west coast of Mexico and into the Southwest. You have people that we know here, ancestral O'odham people, going from sites here in the Phoenix area all the way down to procure shell from the Sea of Cortez. So it's like that would make perfect sense that macaws were coming along that trade route, but we just don't have any evidence that that's true. And again, like I really want it to be true. It's a really great story, but we just don't have any evidence to say that it is. So, and I've even kind of resisted saying like, oh, did they come from the east? Because you could follow the Rio Grande all the way up and into New Mexico kind of thing, and you're right there in the Southwest. But we really don't see any like early on the macaws appear here and then like kind of move across the landscape. They kind of all appear in the Mimbres region, which I really didn't talk about today, and in Chaco Canyon, and in southern Arizona actually as well. Some of the earliest ones occur in central Arizona at the site of Snaketown here. I shouldn't say central, here in the Phoenix area, just south of the Phoenix area at Snaketown. So yeah, it's tough to say. But they don't really seem to map on, as far as we've been able to tell, they don't really seem to map on to some of those larger trade patterns. And we've even tried to the Southwest Social Networks folks are kind of doing these larger studies, and there are just so few macaws relative to the stuff that they're looking at to make kind of meaningful network-based characteristics on how that stuff was moving.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
thank you.
Thank you all for being here, for staying with us 10 minutes past 7. And remember, the museum is closing at 8 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you guys. Thank you so much. Thanks for staying.